March 1944, 17-year-old Susan and her 9-year-old sister Martha, Hungarian Jews whose biggest worry then was their homework. 3 months later, they and their family were rounded up and herded into cattle trucks.
In our truck, it was my parents, my sister, my grandmother, my mother's mother, and my mother's younger sister and her younger daughter. If I thought at all, I assumed, we imagined that the young ones will go to work and the old ones will stay at home.
Susan's father was immediately taken away. She never saw him again. Her mother, her grandmother and sister joined the thousands in lines in front of the notorious Dr. Joseph Mengele. Susan was the only one selected to live.
Behind Mengele there was this Red Cross van, and I thought vaguely, the time this must be for people who feel ill and they'll be taken to the hospital. What I didn't know was that the Zyklon B gas was in it, and it accompanied the people to the gas chambers. So probably an hour later, they were all dead.
And so began Susan's battle to survive.
As if it was all a nightmare. It wasn't really happening, and wake up any moment. Don't forget, the thing was, I didn't know where we were, how long we were going there, and why we were there.
3 months later, Susan was sent to a munitions factory, and then on the march to another death camp, Belsen, she was freed by the Americans. She became an interpreter for the military, then moved to Scotland to be with a great-uncle and his family. But 10 years ago, she went back to Auschwitz.
I went up on this observation platform kind of thing at the main gate, as usually, and I looked down, and I thought, this is another planet. And I tried to remember to visualize myself, person who had been there all those years ago. And again, it was as if that had been another life, somebody else completely. I feel, people ought to hear that it was true, it did happen, and I was there.
Can you forgive and forget?
Forget? No, I'm afraid I can't even forgive.
The memories of an Auschwitz survivor. Well, onto the weather now, much.
Now, I'd like to tell you a little about my mother's time in Auschwitz, and then Melissa and Abby will read some of my mother's own words that she wrote about her experiences. So after she had survived her first selection by Joseph Mengele, Susan and the other women chosen were marched to a building where they were given cold showers and had all their bodily hair shaven. Old, shapeless clothes, more like rags, were thrown at them from a pile on the floor. Susan said when she arrived at Auschwitz, she thought she was arriving in an asylum, an insane asylum, as there were crowds of hairless people in rags all around, screaming at them. Now Susan also was shaven and in rags. Susan was in Auschwitz for almost 2 months. Every day she would have to stand for hour and hour on end for roll call, while the Nazi guards made sure nobody had escaped, in freezing weather which then during the day became incredibly hot. Susan always told me afterwards she decided not to let the Nazis destroy her humanity, her sense of being a civilized human being. In Auschwitz, prisoners were given a small piece of bread in the morning. Most prisoners devoured it immediately, but Susan at least once every week, no more because it could be stolen, She would divide it into 3 small pieces, eating one in the morning, one in the middle of the day, and one at night. She said she would not let the Nazis turn her into an animal. Susan had to undergo a second selection procedure by Mengele at the end of her time in Auschwitz. Mengele was choosing a few to be sent away to a work camp and sending the rest to the gas chambers. All of the women were made to strip and place their clothes on the ground. My mother always insisted afterwards she clearly heard her mother's voice, although her mother had been dead for 2 months by then, say, "Off with your glasses." She took off her glasses and hid them under her clothes, which were lying in front of her. My mother was convinced this saved her life, as all those with glasses were sent to the gas chambers, while she was sent to the work camp. Now, in the summer of 2015, I found 8 pages written by my mother in 1945 about her experiences in Auschwitz. Melissa and Abby will now read a short excerpt from this. Thank you.
Every barrack contained 2 big rooms, and there are 600 to 700 women in each. No beds or straw backs, of course. We slept, i.e. we would have slept if we could, on the floor in dust and dirt, but it was impossible to sleep. We hardly could find any room for sitting down. If we still tried to lie down, there were at least 3 others lying on our legs, stomach and back. My greatest but hopeless wish was in those times to become a sardine and live in the heavenly comfort of a tin of sardines. Sometimes, when I was near to suffocation from the heat and the smell of perspiring bodies, the windows were always shut, climbed over the bodies, which were pressed together so closely that it would have been difficult to drop even a pin among them, and climbed out through the window, though it was strictly forbidden. If I think of those nights at Auschwitz, standing closely by the wall of the barrack, half hidden in the shadow, not to be seen by the guards, it makes my blood run cold.
If the moon was shining, the shadows of the barrack and the numerous meters high towers of the sentries were incredibly big and frightful. If there was no moon, the only light was the reflectors, which now and then swept over the camp in the permanent, never-ceasing flames of the crematoriums. They were at least 5 kilometres far from us, but it seemed to me as if they were just beyond the barracks. The huge red and yellow flames reached the dark sky, and the sight was so frightfully beautiful that I forgot for a minute where I was and enjoyed it. Sometimes I heard slow, sad music from the direction of the crematoriums. It was an orchestra which had to play funeral music to the Jews being burnt. I never could stay long outside. I was chased in the short of a sentry who perceived me. Returning into the barrack, my place was long ago taken, and I tried to regain it. Such a hall of shouting and cursing and rose from the others who were a bit more comfortable now, that I usually spent the rest of the night standing.
Thank you very much, Melissa and Abby. Now, I'll tell you more of my mother's story. The work camp Susan was sent to from Auschwitz was a munitions factory in Lippstadt in Germany. She was supposed to sort aeroplane parts there, but whenever possible, she and her friends would sabotage the parts by mixing them up. So she went there in August 1944, and she was there until the end of March 1945. The end of March 1945, Susan was sent with other prisoners on a forced march to Belsen concentration camp. These forced marches were known as death marches, and most prisoners did not survive them. On their very first night, they were kept in a barn. When they awoke, the German guards were gone. They saw soldiers in the distance, and as my mother could speak English, she was sent to speak to them. She found herself facing a black American soldier, a GI. Afterwards, she said he seemed at least 10 feet tall, which obviously was a bit of an exaggeration. He told her this was the Allied front, but they would be safe in the nearby village. And so my mother and her friends were liberated on the 1st of April 1945, which was Easter Sunday. My mother then became an interpreter for the British Army in Germany, and it was there she met her future husband Paul, who was serving in the British Army. Through the army, she traced her nearest living relatives, a cousin in Palestine and a great aunt and great uncle who were living in Ayr near Glasgow. They had all escaped Europe before the war. So how did my mother end up in Glasgow? What happened was she applied for a visa to go to Palestine, now Israel, via Glasgow. When the visa arrived, however, it was only to go to Glasgow. So that's how my mother first came to Scotland. She arrived in Glasgow in November 1946. Susan relocated to London when she married Paul Singerman in 1947. Unfortunately, her marriage broke up, so she moved back to Glasgow in autumn 1952, and as a single parent with 2 young children, myself and my sister, she gained an honours degree at Glasgow University in French and German, and she then became a teacher, as I mentioned. My mother visited Auschwitz in early 1988. In an interview a few months later, she said, "When I was there, I asked my family, have I done right by you? Did I deserve to survive?" I find that very moving. My mother suffered from survivor guilt, while ironically, many former German officers and soldiers who had done terrible things felt no guilt at all. They just said they were following orders, as if that made it all right. It is a terrible warning. If you lose your own sense of what is right and wrong, and think following orders makes anything right, then terrible things can happen. Never think that, and never accept that. Never lose your own morality, your own sense of what is right and wrong. I will now read a poem about my mother's second selection before Dr. Joseph Mengele, called my mother's favourite song. It's also about fate and destiny. The word bashert in the last verse is a Yiddish word meaning fate. Yiddish was the language spoken by the Jews of Europe before the Second World War. My mother's favourite song. Hey, Surah, Surah, whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Hey, Surah, Surah. That was my mother's favourite song. What happened, happened, however wrong. She did not dwell in bitterness or hate. She grew to learn to accept her fate. That did not mean she forgave and forgot. That was different from accepting her lot. She said, I cannot forget and I cannot forgive. How can I when 6 million died and I lived? She suffered from survivor guilt, although she had no blame. She had losses far deeper than she could ever explain. Returned to Auschwitz in 1988, she stood at the Lake of Ashes alone. Her family's remains were there. She asked, have I been worthy of survival? There was no answer. Her dead mother spoke only once and saved her life. In August 1944, when Susan stood before Mengele, the angel of death. Take off these glasses, her mother's voice said, although her mother was 2 months dead. My mother swore to her dying day that she had heard that voice. She knew it was impossible, but she made her choice. She obeyed her mother, hid those glasses, and survived. Others went to the gas chambers, but she lived. My mother never tried to explain it. She said, that was my fate. That's what it was. It was destiny. It truly was a shirt. Perhaps God looked down on her and decided she had suffered enough. But never could she look kindly on God as her family and 6 million were lost. Thank you very much. Now, to conclude, as I said, in the summer of 2015, I forced myself to read all of my mother's 1945 testimony about her time in Auschwitz. I read about all the horrors she had endured. Then I went outside into the sunlight of a lovely, beautiful day, and I thought, life is full of wonder and beauty. And just thanks to my mother's courage and sacrifices that I, my sister, our 5 children and our grandchildren, all have life. So I say to you all, love, appreciate, and enjoy life, for it is a very precious thing. Thank you very much.